The room went quiet the moment Bumpy Johnson finished speaking. Not the polite quiet of men waiting their turn, but the heavy, dangerous silence of men calculating consequences. It was 1967, late afternoon, in a private dining room above a midtown Italian restaurant that had never appeared on any map. The curtains were drawn. The wine had gone untouched. Around the table sat captains of the Italian Mafia, men who had ordered murders with a nod, men whose surnames were spoken in whispers from Little Italy to Brooklyn. And at the head of that table sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was older now. The fire in his eyes had not dimmed, but it had sharpened. His hair was gray at the temples, his suit perfectly pressed, his posture calm in a way that made younger men uneasy. Bumpy didn't fidget, didn't raise his voice. He never had to. A Genovese emissary had just finished delivering a message, disguised as an offer. Harlem, they said, was changing. Federal heat was increasing. The Italians needed things quieter, cleaner. They suggested Bumpy step back, let younger men handle certain corners, let outside interests assist in areas he had controlled for decades. It was disrespect wrapped in diplomacy. And Bumpy Johnson had listened without interruption. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table, eyes moving slowly from face to face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, almost gentle. "I've buried friends over less than what you just said. No threats, no shouting, just truth." One of the younger captains scoffed under his breath. A mistake. Bumpy's eyes locked onto him, not with anger, but with something colder, experience, finality. "This is my last conversation like this," Bumpy said, "not because I'm tired, because I'm finished explaining who I am." The Italians shifted. Chairs creaked. They had expected negotiation, maybe intimidation. What they were hearing sounded like a farewell, but not the kind that ends with surrender. What none of them knew, what history would only piece together years later, was that Bumpy Johnson already understood something they didn't. He knew his time was running short, and he knew exactly how he wanted to leave the board. Those words, spoken calmly, without flourish, would become known in whispered retellings as Bumpy Johnson's final words to the Mafia. Not because he died that day, but because after that meeting, the balance between Harlem and the mob changed forever. To understand why those words carried such weight, you had to understand the man who spoke them and the world that shaped him. Because Bumpy Johnson was never just a gangster. He was a line that could not be crossed, and every man at that table knew it. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson did not rise from chaos. He was forged by it. Harlem in the 1930s and 40s was a kingdom under siege. Its streets pulsed with music, numbers runners, hustlers, preachers, and politicians. Jazz poured from basement clubs, and ambition crowded every sidewalk. But power, real power, still answered to men who didn't live there. White bankers, white politicians, and increasingly white mobsters who believed Harlem was simply another territory to be extracted. Bumpy Johnson learned early that survival in that world required more than muscle. It required memory, patience, and an iron sense of dignity. By the time the Italians first noticed him, Bumpy already controlled the numbers racket in Harlem, not with random brutality, but with structure. He paid his people. He protected widows. He made sure rent got covered when luck ran cold. Harlem didn't see him as a predator. They saw him as order, and that was dangerous. The Mafia understood something fundamental. You could buy fear, but loyalty had to be earned. Bumpy had earned it. He partnered with Lucky Luciano not because he needed protection, but because Harlem needed peace. The deal was simple. Italians supplied resources, Bumpy ran the streets. No interference, no humiliation, mutual respect. For decades, that agreement held. But the 1960s were different. The federal government was watching everything. The civil rights marches filled the avenues. Black power rhetoric scared City Hall and the mob alike. Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a symbol, and symbols attract pressure. Younger Italian captains saw Bumpy as old world, a relic. They didn't remember the bodies that had fallen before the truce. They saw spreadsheets and indictments, not history. Bumpy, on the other hand, remembered everything. He remembered police batons cracking skulls in alleyways. He remembered being called boy by men half his caliber. He remembered standing alone in rooms where every man expected him to beg, and he never did. By the time of that private Midtown meeting, Bumpy Johnson was nearing the end of his life, but not the end of his authority. Harlem still answered to him. The numbers still ran through his people. When he walked the street, men straightened their backs. Women nodded with respect. The Mafia's mistake wasn't thinking he was old. It was thinking age had made him weak. What they didn't see was that Bumpy Johnson had already made peace with mortality, and men who have done that do not negotiate the same way as those still afraid to lose. The meeting wasn't about territory. It was about erasure. And Bumpy Johnson had spent his entire life refusing to be erased. The challenge didn't arrive with gunfire. It arrived with paperwork. Within weeks of that Midtown meeting, subtle changes began to ripple through Harlem's underworld. Numbers runners were stopped and questioned more aggressively. Italian-connected bookmakers appeared on corners that had been untouched for years. Payments were delayed. Messages went unanswered. To the untrained eye, it looked like coincidence. To Bumpy Johnson, it looked like pressure. The Mafia wasn't declaring war. That would have been loud, messy, bad for business. Instead, they were testing the perimeter, seeing how much of Harlem they could reclaim without ever saying his name. That was the insult. A Genovese lieutenant was sent north with a smile and a handshake, claiming confusion. Miscommunication, he called it. New guys don't know the old boundaries. Bumpy listened, nodding slowly, letting the man finish every sentence. Then he asked one question. How many funerals you willing to pay for before this gets clarified? The lieutenant laughed nervously, said nobody wanted trouble, said times were changing. Bumpy didn't argue. He simply ended the meeting. Behind closed doors, Harlem reacted faster than the Mafia expected. Shopkeepers complained. Runners refused to work unfamiliar corners. Community leaders quietly reached out, not to the police, but to Bumpy. That's when the Mafia understood the depth of their miscalculation. This wasn't just a man they were challenging. It was a system. Still, pride has a way of clouding judgment. The younger captains pushed harder. They convinced themselves that Bumpy's age would slow his response, that he would choose compromise over conflict. So they made it personal. Word reached Bumpy that one of his longtime associates had been approached with a retirement offer, cash, protection, a clean exit, if he spoke against Bumpy's leadership. Bumpy didn't explode. He didn't threaten. He invited the man to dinner. 2 hours later, the associate walked out shaken, loyal, and silent. No violence, no intimidation, just truth. You leave now, Bumpy had told him calmly, and you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. You stay, and you'll walk Harlem like a free man. The associate stayed. That was when the Mafia escalated to the final move. Another meeting request arrived, this one more formal. Higher-ranking names attached, neutral ground. A chance, they said, to clear the air. Bumpy agreed, not because he believed them, but because he had already decided how the story would end. The Italians thought they were walking into a negotiation. Bumpy Johnson walked in knowing it would be his last lesson. The second meeting took place on neutral ground, but nothing about it felt neutral. A private back room, no windows, one door, 4 Italian captains, 1 elder consigliere, and Bumpy Johnson seated alone on the opposite side of the table. No bodyguards, no entourage. That alone unsettled them. Men like Bumpy didn't travel light unless they were making a statement. The consigliere spoke first, his tone respectful but firm. He talked about changing times, federal pressure, the need for shared oversight. He avoided words like control or takeover, but everyone in the room understood what he meant. Bumpy listened without blinking. Then the youngest captain leaned forward, impatience in his voice. "With respect," the man said, "Harlem doesn't belong to anyone forever." That was the moment. Bumpy Johnson slowly reached into his jacket, not in haste, not threatening. He pulled out nothing more dangerous than a folded piece of paper. He placed it gently on the table and pushed it forward. "Read that," he said. The consigliere opened it. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a threat. It was a list. Names, dates, locations. Funerals the Mafia had paid for in Harlem when boundaries were crossed. Deals broken, lines ignored, every entry precise. Every consequence remembered. Bumpy finally spoke again. "You see, I don't rule Harlem because I'm feared," he said quietly. "I rule it because I remember." The room tightened. He leaned back slightly, eyes steady. "I kept your men safe here when the cops wanted blood. I kept your money clean when the heat came down. And I did it without asking to be called anything other than my name." Then came the words, the ones that would echo. "If you want Harlem after I'm gone," Bumpy said, "you'll get it the honest way. Over my body, not over my respect." No shouting, no drama, just finality. The youngest captain opened his mouth to respond, but the consigliere raised a hand, silencing him. The older man studied Bumpy carefully, seeing perhaps for the first time that this wasn't a negotiation at all. It was a boundary. The consigliere nodded once. "We understand," he said. Bumpy stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, turning just enough for his words to carry. "This was my last warning," he said calmly. "Next time, Harlem answers for itself." Then he left. No deal was signed. No hand was shaken. But the Mafia knew something irreversible had just occurred. They had not been threatened. They had been dismissed. The aftermath didn't arrive with headlines. It arrived with absence. Italian bookmakers quietly pulled back from Harlem corners they had tested weeks earlier. Numbers runners who had been confused suddenly remembered boundaries with perfect clarity. Phone calls that once went unanswered were returned, politely, promptly, without conditions. No announcement was made. None was needed. In the weeks following the meeting, Harlem settled into a familiar rhythm. Not peaceful. Harlem was never peaceful, but ordered, predictable. The kind of order that only existed when everyone understood who stood where. The Mafia never issued an apology. Men like that rarely did, but they sent something far more telling. Restraint. A Genovese captain quietly redirected an ambitious crew toward Brooklyn. A proposed partnership in Harlem was postponed indefinitely. And when a rogue Italian-connected hustler tried to muscle into a numbers route near 135th Street, he wasn't touched. Not by Bumpy's men, not by violence, but by isolation. No suppliers, no protection, no work. He left within days. The message was clear. Bumpy Johnson's words had not drawn blood, but they had drawn lines. Inside Harlem, the response was immediate and emotional. Community leaders spoke in lowered voices, grateful not for domination, but for dignity. Shop owners reopened late. Runners worked without fear of sudden disappearances. For the first time in months, uncertainty eased. Bumpy didn't celebrate. He rarely did. Those closest to him noticed the fatigue settling deeper into his shoulders. He spent more time alone, took longer walks, spoke less, but with more weight. Men who had known him for decades sensed something was changing, not in his authority, but in his urgency. He had said what needed to be said. He had done what needed to be done. And now Harlem stood on its feet, not leaning on borrowed power. Law enforcement noticed the shift too. Surveillance reports mentioned unexpected stability. Informants had less to sell. The streets weren't quiet, but they weren't chaotic either. It frustrated the police more than open war ever could, because order without permission was dangerous. Yet no move came against Bumpy. Not then. Even the Mafia understood that touching him now would cost more than it gained. Killing a man was easy. Erasing a symbol was not. Justice in Bumpy's world didn't mean revenge. It meant balance restored, and balance, once regained, was something everyone, even his enemies, respected. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died not long after, not in a blaze of gunfire, not in handcuffs, but quietly, seated in a Harlem restaurant, his heart finally giving out after decades of pressure no doctor could measure. The streets did not erupt. They stood still. Word traveled faster than sirens ever could. By nightfall, storefronts dimmed their lights. Men who had never met him spoke his name with reverence. Women who had benefited from his unseen generosity whispered prayers over dinner tables. The Mafia sent no flowers, but they sent instructions. No Harlem operations were to be disturbed, no transitions rushed, no advantage taken. The elders remembered his words and honored them in their own way. For years after his death, Italian crews treated Harlem differently, not as open territory, not as a prize, but as a place that had already claimed its champion. You could measure Bumpy Johnson's legacy in numbers, years of control, deals made, wars avoided, but that would miss the point. His real legacy was posture, how Harlem carried itself after him. Young men who stepped into leadership roles didn't imitate his violence. They imitated his restraint. They learned that power didn't need volume, that respect could be enforced without spectacle. That memory was the sharpest weapon of all. Historians would later debate his morality. Lawmen would reduce him to a criminal profile, but the people who lived under his watch knew better. Bumpy Johnson never pretended to be clean. He pretended to be fair. And in a world that offered Harlem very little fairness, that mattered. The Mafia never again summoned a single black man into a room and spoke to him like he was temporary. That unspoken rule traced back to one folded piece of paper slid across a table, and the calm certainty of a man who had already made peace with his end. That was the secret behind Bumpy Johnson's final words to the Mafia. They weren't a threat. They were a transfer of responsibility. "You'll get it the honest way," he had said. And for once, the mob listened. This wasn't just a story about the Mafia. It wasn't even just a story about Bumpy Johnson. It was a lesson in how power truly works when it's rooted in memory, restraint, and self-respect. Bumpy Johnson didn't dominate Harlem by force alone. He did it by standing firm when men with larger armies assumed time would erase him. He understood something most never do, that the most dangerous man in the room is the one who no longer needs to prove he belongs there. His final words to the Mafia weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of a lifetime spent defending dignity in a world built to deny it. This was about more than territory, more than money, more than crime. It was about a community refusing to be treated as disposable. And sometimes, history doesn't remember the quiet moments, but legends do, because respect, once earned the hard way, never truly dies.